Hello students and welcome to the lecture. So as we can see here, in this lecture we are going to start with the polity and this is going to be the part 1. Before starting the actual lecture, we have the small disclaimer as usual which we are required to understand before we proceed further. The disclaimer goes like, the images used in a slide deck are for educational purposes only. We respect the intellectual property rights of the original creators and owners of these images. If you are the owner of any of the images used in this tag and have any concerns or issues, please contact us at sathi@iitk.ac.in and we shall remove the images. So, if we look at the historical background of Indian polity, we need to cover it from the British era. Prior to the British era, the Indian country was divided into the small fragmented kingdoms, and these kingdoms had their own separate rules. That means if there is one rule in one kingdom, that same rule is not applicable in another kingdom. But when Britishers came to India and they started occupying the country and making India in their colony, or you can say starting transforming India into their colony, basically they tried to impose a unified system. And that was the first time when India was experiencing anything like this. So, the historical background of Indian polity start from the British era. And British era also divided into three parts that we are going to see here. Like first, we have to cover when the Britishers came in India and how the things got began. So that was the year of 1608 when the Britishers came to India as traders in the form of East India Company. The East India Company, all of you have heard this name before, right? The original name of East India Company was the Governors and Merchants of England trading into East. In short, it is known as East India Company. And there is also a nickname for East India Company. Nickname was John Company. Among the officials and employees of the East India Company, the name of East India Company was John Company. Why it's so? There is no written document we have to support why we call it John Company as a nickname, but it was called as a John Company among its members. So, when Britishers came to India in 1608, the Indian ruler was Jahangir, and the first British ship that came to India name was Red Dragon. First representative of East India Company who came to India, his name was Captain Hawkins. He came to India in the court of Jahangir and asked the permission for trade. And the main port they demanded to start a trade from, that port was Surat. Surat was the prominent port in Gujarat under the Mughal rule. But because the you can say Mughals had good relations with Portuguese, so that's why Jahangir first denied. But when the Britishers succeeded to remove the Portuguese influence from the Surat, finally the Jahangir granted a permission to Captain Hawkins. After Captain Hawkins, Thomas Roy, who came to the court of Jahangir as an ambassador of Britishers, proposed a proposal to expand the trade with India. So here we could conclude that first the Britishers came to India with the intention of trading. Okay, they had no intention to rule the country at first. Later on, yes, that thing got you can say changed into the ruling ambitions. But first, they had only one ambition, that was trading. In 1765, the East India Company obtained the Diwani rights. Now, Diwani rights were famously known as the rights to cover the revenue and providing us civil justice. Remember, we are talking about the civil justice, we are not talking about the criminal justice. Okay, so Diwani rights means the revenue collection rights and the civil justice, and the three states they got at first, the states were Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. Like in 1764, a famous battle of Buxar happened where the one side of Britishers fighting with the joint armies of Sajauddaulah, Shah Alam II and Mir Zafar. But the Britishers defined this combined army, and then, as per the treaty, the Britishers demanded the Diwani rights of Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. And Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II had to grant it these rights after losing the Battle of Buxar against the East India Company. So that was the first instant when the Britishers started participating in India's economical and political control. Then, from 1773 till 1858, the British East India Company established its rules. That means the British government was not participating in Indian affairs directly. So that tenure was totally running by the East India Company. So we designated it as a company rule tenure. In 1858, or you can say mainly 1857. In 1857, the famous revolt happened against the Britishers. The British historians called it as the Sepoy Mutiny, while the Indian historians called it as the First War for the Independence. But whatsoever we call it, it is obvious after 1857, in 1858, the British Crown assumed the direct responsibility for governance of India. Like before it, they had left it on the company to rule the country. But after seeing this revolt, the British Crown assumed the direct control over the governance of India, and the participation of East India Company got restricted. Then, the second tenure of British rule started from 1858 and ended at 1947, that is known as the company rule. Sorry, crown rule, not company rule. Because now the British Crown had the direct responsibility or control over the Indian country. So that's how the two phases of British rule divided: company rule and crown rule. Please remember the tenure: 1773 till 1858, the company rule was there. 1858 till 1947, the crown rule was there. And what happened, I have told you already. Like Battle of Buxar, then you can say the revolt of 1857, and that's how the company rule ended and the crown rule began. That got finally ended in 1947 when the India got independence from the Britishers. So the company rule 1773 till 1858. Let's have a look on it. First, the Regulating Act 1773, then Amending Act of 1781, then Pitt's India Act 1784, then Act of 1786, then Charter Act of 1793, then Charter Act 1813, then Charter Act 1833, Charter Act 1853. After the Crown Rule that started from 1858 ended at 1947, Government of India Act 1858, Indian Councils Act of successive years of 1861, then 1892, and finally 1909, Government of India Act 1919, Government of India Act 1935, and finally Indian Independence Act 1947. So these acts that you are seeing here, starting from Regulating Act 1773 and ended at Charter Act 1853, all these acts got passed when the company was ruling the country. That means company rule. And these acts that started from Government of India Act 1858 and ended at Indian Independence Act 1947. At that time, the British Crown and you can say the British Parliament had the direct control over the country, hence Crown rule. Okay, so this division is important because sometimes the question may be asked: Pitt's India Act 1784 was passed when? Who was ruling? the company or the crown. So remember, the company was ruling because we could go through this timeline that state 1773 to 1858. And for crown rule, 1858 to 1947. Okay. So first act was the Regulating Act of 1773. Remember, when Regulating Act of 1773 was came, on that time the British Prime Minister was Lord North. So after 1764, when the company got the Diwani rights and they started collecting the revenue and the civil matters. So basically, on that time, the British Parliament realized that company activities need to be controlled. So that's why they passed the Regulating Act of 1773 with some provision in order to control the company's governance in the country of India. Key points: the beginning of parliamentary control over the government of the company, as I have told you. The British government laid the foundation of central administration in India. Previously, the Indian country was governing by so many kingdoms, so that's why the Indian country did not have any centralized administration. That was began with the Regulating Act of 1773. First time the British government recognized the political and administrative functions of the East India Company, in short known as EIC. As after the 1764 they got only Diwani rights. That means mostly they were related with the economic policies and the revenue collection. But in the Regulating Act, the political interference and the administrative functions of the EIC got laid down in a proper framework so that the company's activity in these sphere of politics and administration must be controlled and must be monitored. Features of the Act: Governor of Bengal was made Governor General of Bengal, and governors of Bombay and Madras presidencies were made his subordinates. So, Britishers had three presidencies in the country of India: Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. Their formation years, if we go by, so remember, the Bengal presidency was established in 1690, the Madras presidency was established in 1639, and the Bombay presidency was established at 1618. So, first, the Bengal presidency. Whosoever would be the Governor General of Bengal, he will be, sorry, whosoever would be the Governor of Bengal, he will be designated as the Governor General of Bengal. And the other two presidencies, like Madras and Bombay, whosoever would be the governor of these presidencies would be act as a subordinate to the Governor General of Bengal. So the position of Governor General of Bengal was created during the Regulating Act of 1773. And the first Governor General of Bengal was appointed as Warren Hastings. So he was the first Governor General of Bengal. Remember it. During this period, the Britishers also working for the judiciary system in India. So they established the Supreme Court at Kolkata in 1774 with original and appellate jurisdiction. Now, what do you mean by the original and appellate jurisdiction? Original jurisdiction is a case when the court is hearing the case. Like you can say there are two people, X and Y, they had some kind of dispute, and when they go into the court had decided the matter in favor of Mr. Y. But Mr. X thought that he is not getting a justice from it. So he could apply it, the matter, to the upper court for listening, and now the upper court will decide the matter again. So the original jurisdiction is actually when the case is hearing for the first time. The appellate jurisdiction is when any of the party involving in the dispute appeal to the higher court for the matter resolution or listening the case again. The Supreme Court that was established in Kolkata had Chief Justice and three other judges. That means the total strength was four judges. Also introduced the four-member council. The court of directors should report all affairs related with the revenue, civil administration, and military administration to the British government, so that the British government should be aware about what is going on in India and could act accordingly. So that was about the Regulating Act of 1773. Now, Amending Act of 1781. To address the shortcomings of the Regulating Act of 1773. So, what were the shortcomings of that particular act? First, the Governor General position was created, but with some limited powers only. So, that means that was some kind of puppet position, as the Governor General was not freely allowed to take the decision by his own. Second, the Supreme Court interference. The Supreme Court had the powers to interfere in the company's matter and the governance of the country. So that was generating a conflict between the company and the Supreme Court. Third, the powers of Supreme Court were not well defined. So because of this, the Supreme Court had excessive powers and has less power at the same time, because the division of power was not completely defined in the Regulating Act of 1773. So, to overcome these shortcomings, the British Parliament enacted the Amending Act of 1781, and this act, also known as Act of Settlement or Declaratory Act. So, remember this name we use for the Amendment Act of 1781. This legislation granted immunity to the Governor General and his council, shielding them from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court for their official action. It means if the Governor General and his four-member council, they are taking any decision under their official capacity, so that decision could not be challenged in the Supreme Court. That was to ensure the proper official functioning of the Governor General and his council, and stop the interference of Supreme Court in the day-to-day governance and administration system established by the company to rule the India. Additionally, it exempted the company's servant from Supreme Court jurisdiction regarding their official action. So not only the top leadership, that means Governor General and his council, but the subordinates or mid or lower levels of company's governance system, like company servant, they got also exempted. But remember, in the official action, if they are doing anything in their personal capacity, that could be challenged in the Supreme Court. But if they are doing anything in their official capacity, that should not be challenged in the Supreme Court as per the provisions of Amending Act 1781. This act specifically excluded the revenue matters and issues related to the revenue collection from the Supreme Court's jurisdiction. It means whatsoever policy the East India Company was acquiring in collection of revenue, deciding the tax rate, and distribution of the tax, that policy should not be discussed in the court of law. That means the Supreme Court jurisdiction will not be applied on this policy. For Hindus, the Hindu law was permitted, and for Muslims, the Mohammedan law was permitted. It means that at first the Supreme Court had to go by the Hindu law if any Hindu matter came to the court, and had to go by Mohammedan law if any Muslim matter came to the court. It vested the Governor General in council with the power to formulate regulations for the provincial courts and council. Then the Pitt's India Act of 1784. Features of the act. The company's activities were divided into the commercial and political activities. So we could say when the 1764 Buxar battle concluded. So there were two types of rights, Diwani rights and Faujdari rights. The Diwani rights were mainly concluded and related with civil and revenue collection. The second, Faujdari, they had criminal and administration provisions. So when the Britishers acquired the rights, they were mainly interested in the Diwani rights. It means they want to control the revenue collection and the civil matters only. They did not want to participate in the criminal matters and administration of the country. But later on, the Britishers realized that they had to participate in the criminal and administration matters also if they want to make sure that their rule would continue for a long. Okay? Or you can say on that time, the rulers, okay, who were left with the criminal and administration matters, they had the control over the military, they had the control over the civil administration. So that's why they had a power to influence the revenue collection and civil matters. And in order to reduce this influence, the Britishers required to participate in the Faujdari rights also, which they acquired over the period of time. But the commercial and the political activities, that means the Diwani and Faujdari, was not properly decided. And that was actually the bone of contention between the company's policy and the British government intentions. So that's why, to overcome this situation, the British government decided to define the commercial and political activities of company so that a proper check could be acquired on these activities and the company servant and officials could be held responsible for their actions regarding this. They reiterated the supremacy of the British Parliament over the administration of the company. That means the British Parliament will not directly tell what the company should do in managing of the administration of its own. Reduce the strength of the council from 4 to 3. That means in the Regulating Act of 1773, the 4-member council was introduced, but that number was reduced from 4 to 3 during the Pitt's India Act of 1784. Companies' territories in India were for the first time called the British possession in India. Because right now the Britishers had the entire control over the Faujdari and Diwani rights. That means they did not working as the dual government. Dual government means now the government had two rules, right? Two roles the government had. First, civil, and second, the criminal. In civil, the socio-economic policy and all covered. In criminal, the military and other aspects covered. So Britishers acquired only civil and left the criminal. So that actually established the dual government. Okay. And the first British official who ended this dual government, he was Warren Hastings. So Warren Hastings, who was the first Governor General of Bengal, ensured that the civil and criminal rights must be held by one entity only, and that should be the East India Company. So he ended this dual government. And that's why the British territories that got acquired by the East India Company in India, they were called as the British possession in India. The act also allowed the court of directors to manage the commercial affairs and created a new body that we called as the Board of Controller, which had 6 members to manage the political affairs, to supervise and direct all operations of the civil and military government or revenues of the British possession in India. Thus, it established the system of dual government again. So now you will say that this is the dual government. So why we are saying that the Warren Hastings ended this? So here you can say Warren Hastings ended the dual government in India itself. Like you can say the Diwani rights were given to the EIC or East India Company, while the Faujdari rights were remaining with the local rulers. That system was ended by Warren Hastings. But when the Britishers came to India, or you can say British laws came to India, basically like the Pitt's India Act of 1784. So here you can say the company's own administration remained with the EIC, while their political, military, revenue collection, all these matters were given to the Board of Controllers or BOC. Okay, and BOC directly reporting it to the British government. So again, you can say that established the dual government format because the British government was not directly participating, but still they have the board of controllers to look after the company's activity in the country of India so that they could formulate a policy accordingly. Now, the Act of 1786. In 1786, Lord Cornwallis assumed the role of Governor General of Bengal, accompanied by the two demands for accepting the position. So, after the Warren Hastings, Lord Cornwallis was selected by the British government to be appointed as the Governor General of Bengal. But before he accepted this position, he formulated two demands in front of the British Parliament. First, he sought the authority to override his council's decision in special cases. That means if the council had four people, including the Governor General of Bengal, and if the other three people were not agree on certain decision, so he demanded, being a Governor General of Bengal, he must have the power to override the decision in some special cases. Secondly, he desired to hold the position of Commander in Chief. To accommodate these requests, the Act of 1786 was enacted, incorporating with both provisions. Here is one point also, like if we're talking about the Lord Cornwallis, so remember, the Lord Cornwallis also regarded as the father of civil services because he introduces two format of civil services in India during his tenure. The first format was covenanted civil services, second format was uncovenanted civil services. Covenanted civil services were introduced to appoint the person at higher positions in the civil services. The uncovenanted was to appoint a person at lower position in civil services. The higher position were reserved for the Britishers only, and the lower positions were allowed to accommodate Indians also. So these two positions were introduced by Lord Cornwallis. So remember, he is often credited as the father of Indian civil services. And two services that he created, the names are covenanted and covenanted. Covenanted stands out for higher positions only for Britishers. Uncovenanted stands out for lower positions only for Indians. Now, the Charter Act of 1793. Let's look at it. First, expanded the overriding authority initially granted to Lord Cornwallis over his council. Like we know, when Lord Cornwallis was selected to be appointed as a Governor General, he demanded the two things, right? One was that he could override his council decision in some special cases. All right. So that thing had been expanded to all future Governor Generals and Governors of Presidency, which means the privilege granted to Lord Cornwallis, now that privilege would be granted to the person who would be appointed as a Governor General of Bengal in future and governors of presidencies as well. This move aimed to enhance the powers and control of the Governor General over subordinate presidencies like Bombay and Madras. The act prolonged the East India Company's trade monopoly in India for an additional 20 years. When the East India Company formed by the Royal Charter of England, so that company got some kind of monopoly, which means except East India Company, no other merchant company of UK was allowed to do a trade with India. That established a monopoly in trade with India in respect of East India Company. That monopoly was further extended for additional 20 years in 1793. It stipulated that the commander in chief would not automatically be a member of Governor General's Council unless specifically appointed, which means the political and military. These two organs separated until or unless the Governor General's Council required the military commander in chief to be the part. The commander in chief would not participate in politics. So the military would be remain separate from the politics. The act mandated that the members of the board of control and their staff would be compensated from Indian revenues moving forward. In order to enhance the Indian revenue and economic activities in India, the board of controllers and the staff's salary was decided to be paid from the Indian revenue. The more the revenue, the more the compensation. Charter Act of 1813. Features of the Act. It put an end to the East India Company's monopoly in India, with the exception of trade with China and trade in tea with India. Like, as we know, in 1793, the additional 20 years was granted to the East India Company to do a trade monopoly. But because of the increased pressure on the British Crown as well as the British government, finally, the British government decided to end the trade monopoly of East India Company with India, which means other merchants and organizations of England were allowed to do a trade with India, but still, the trade with China monopolized by East India Company and tea trade with India, that also. These two aspects even remain closed for the other merchants, and these aspects even remained under the East India Company. This act affirmed the British Crown sovereignty over the company's territory in India, marking the explicit definition of the constitutional position of British territories in India for the first time. Like British Crown not really participating in the territories affairs acquired by the company in India, but he constitutionally exerted the sovereignty. It means he became the nominal head. For the first time, the Indian territories marked as the British territories as per the constitutional position of Crown. The Act facilitated the spread of Western education amongst the resident of British territories in India, which means the territories acquired by the Britishers in India, these territories would have the Western education system instead of Indian traditional education system, allocating 1 lakh rupees for education in native India. That was the educational budget. Granted authority to local governments in India to levy taxes on individuals and empowered them to enforce penalties on those who fail to pay their taxes. Revenue consolidation that occurred after the Battle of Buxar, that revenue consolidation was breakdown in Charter Act of 1813, which means the local government participation was ensured in order to levy taxes, collection of the taxes, and also imposition of penalties on the individuals or persons who fail to obey the tax law. Indian trade was thrown open to all the British subjects. As you can see here, the East India Company's monopoly was ended, except the two provisions trade with China and trade in tea with India. These two provisions still remain with the company, and rest other areas were open to all the British subjects. Missionaries allowed to preach in India. The Christian missionaries got permission from the British government that they could come in India and they could preach the people of India and run a religious movement. The company rule further extended for another 20 years. Then comes the Charter Act of 1833. Features of the Act. The Governor General of Bengal designated as Governor General of India, with Lord William Bentinck being the first. Like the first Regulating Act of 1773 created a position of Governor General of Bengal. Warren Hastings became the first person to got appointed on this position. This Charter Act of 1833 renamed the position as Governor General of India, and the first person to got appointed was William Bentinck. Okay. Final steps towards centralization. Like previously, they were more doing administration purposes on the presidency's basis. Like the Governor General of Bengal presidency would have some kind of control over the other presidencies of Bombay and Madras also. But when they changed the position from Bengal to India, like Governor General of Bengal to Governor General of India, they actually started the process of centralization. Now, whosoever would be appointed to this position would have control over all the territories acquired by the British. Legislative powers of the governors of Bombay and Madras were revoked. That means previously they had the legislative powers to make a laws in respect of their presidency. But now they would have to obey the single law that would be drafted by the Governor General of India. Transform the East India Company from a commercial entity to a purely administrative one. A law member represented by Macaulay was introduced in the Governor General's Council to make a law and legislatives. This provision for open competition was nullified by this act. Restrictions on the immigration of Europeans and property acquisition were lifted, which means the Europeans now allowed to come in India and acquire the properties and all. Indian laws were codified and consolidated. Like previously, we know the Hindus were governing by the Hindu law and the Muslims were governing by the Mohammedan law. That provision was now codified. That means the Britishers now codified the provisions and even consolidate them to make a one single law to govern the both subject of Hindus and Muslims. No Indian was denied employment under the company based on religion or color. Slavery was abolished. The first faint beginnings of a center legislature for India. Like we could see here, the position even changed from Bengal to India. That means now the Governor General's Council will be a center legislature for India instead of legislature for Bengal presidency extended towards Bombay and Madras presidency. The first law commission was pioneered in 1834 under the chairmanship of Lord Macaulay. Then the Charter Act of 1853. Features of the Act. It delineated the legislative and executive functions of the Governor General's Council, establishing a clear separation. Like previously, the lawmaking and implementation of the law, both the functions of legislative and the executive mixed in the Governor General's Council. Like no one is clearly defined to be the executor, no one is clearly defined towards the legislator. But after this act, the Governor General's Council got a clear definition to be appointed as legislator and the executor. The act allowed for the addition of 6 new members. They termed as legislative councillors and they got appointed towards the council. That became known as the Indian Central Legislative Council. Marked the initiation of local representation in the Indian Central Legislative Council. It means India is now allowed to be the part of this council as an ex officio. That means their vote doesn't matter in the meeting, but their opinions could be given to the other legislators while formulating a law. The Act introduced open competition for civil services, opening up the coveted civil service position to Indians. Like the Cornwallis introduced the two kind of civil service in India, covenanted and uncovenanted. The covenanted of lower positions were previously allowed to India, but the covenanted were reserved for British only. Now that got opened for Indians also under the provisions of Charter Act of 1853. Indians and the Britishers, both students will compete in the civil service exam to pass the exam. The Governor General was granted the authority to veto bills. Like the Cornwallis got overriding powers over his council. Now these overriding powers termed as veto bills, which means if the Governor General is not in a favor of certain bill, but his council is, then the Governor General could apply the power of veto. That means if he exercise the veto, that provision will be nullified. Doesn't matter what the council thinks. So here the company rule ended. And now it is the beginning of Crown rule from 1858 to 1947. The first act that passed under this time period of Crown rule was Government of India Act 1858. Features of the act. That act, also known as the Act for the Good Government of India. Rule of company was replaced by the rule of crown. Changed the designation of the Governor General of India to that of Viceroy of India. Viceroy became the agent of the crown, Lord Canning being the first viceroy. This act abolished the East India Company and transferred the powers of government, territories, and revenues to British Crown. This act abolished the dual government of the Pitt's India Act. This act also ended the doctrine of lapse. The Secretary of State was a member of the British Cabinet and was ultimately responsible to the British Parliament. Established a 15-member Council of India to assist the Secretary of India for India. And Secretary of State could be sued in England and in India, and in India also. Now, if we talk about it, so remember the revolt of 1857 played an important role in abolition of companies rule in India and establishment of crown rule in India. After the revolt of 1857, the British government first changed the position of Governor General of India towards the Viceroy of India. Lord Canning became the first person to be appointed as the Viceroy of India. Now, what is the difference between the Governor General and the Viceroy of India? So, Governor General was a appointed authority, right? He was appointed by the British Parliament to rule on behalf of the British government in the country of India. But the Viceroy is actually not an appointed position. It's a representative position. Like the Viceroy is much more powerful than the position of Governor General of India because he is considered as the direct representation of British Crown in the country. So he is not required to obey the British Parliament policy. Instead of this, he could rule on behalf of the British Crown directly. The powers of government, territories, and revenues were snatched from the East India Company and directly transferred to the British Crown. The Board of Controllers that got established during the Pitt's India Act, that means the dual government, economic and political, right? That provision were ended in the Government of India Act of 1850. The doctrine of lapse. That means if there is any ruler in the country of India who has no natural heir to the crown, so his territory will be acquired by the Britishers directly. So that's how several territories of India like Satara, like Nagpur, like Jaitapur, Sambalpur, like Jhansi, like Awadh, these territories were acquired by the British government directly, and that paved a way towards the political conflict that got later transferred into the revolt of 1857. So, all these things that paved a way to the revolt of 1857, that things were abolished after the Government of India Act 1858. Even the new Secretary of State position was created to look after the work of the Viceroy. Like remember, the Secretary of State was not allowed to participate in the working of Viceroy, but he is there to look after the thing. And even he got assisted by the 15-member council, and he could be sued in India and in England also. Like that position was not that much powerful and not a position that could be out of control. Okay. So these provisions were brought after the Government of India Act 1858. Then Indian Councils Act like 1861, 1892 and 1909. Features of the Indian Council Act of 1861. This act made a beginning of representative institutions associated Indians with their lawmaking process. Like the Indians were now allowed in the large numbers to be the part of the legislative councils. But still remember, these were ex officio members. It means they had no right to vote in the meetings, but they could have the representation to speak out when the laws are making. Viceroy nominated some Indians as non-official members of his expanded council. Three Indians nominated on that time were Raja of Banaras, Maharaja of Patiala, and Sir Dinkar Rao. The trend of decentralization was initiated by this act, restored the legislative powers of the Bombay and Madras presidencies so that the local rule could be governed as per the local problems. Like you can say, the Bombay and the Madras, two presidencies are there. They had their own ways, they had their own affairs to be dealt with. But if the central government would be making the laws of these areas, so might be the laws are not suitable for there. So that's why the Bombay and Madras presidencies again got a power to make the law as per the local circumstances. It thus reversed the centralizing tendency that started from the Regulating Act of 1773, recognized the portfolio system that was introduced by the Lord Canning in 1859, empowered the Viceroy to frame the rules of business, the same power given to the President of India under the Article 77. New legislative councils for Bengal, NWFF, FP, that means Northwestern Frontier Province, and Punjab. Act empowered the VOI, Viceroy of India, to make ordinance during an emergency. Like today, the president could do it. However, the life of such an ordinance was only 6 months. Like maximum time the ordinance could be in effect was only 6 months. Then the Indian Council Act of 1892 that enlarged the size and functions of central and provincial councils. Council to have the right to discuss the budget under the certain conditions. Members of the council granted the right to ask the question over the budgetary provisions. The members had the power to form a new laws and alter or repeal old laws with Governor General's permission. First attempt at introducing a representative and popular element was introduced in the Indian Council Act of 1909, that is also known as Morley-Minto reform. Because Lord Minto was the Viceroy of India at that time and Lord Morley was the Secretary of State of India on that time. So they both introduced this act, so that's why it is known as Morley-Minto reform. Councils for the first time were referred to as the legislative councils, like means clearly defined that this council is there for making a law. Members were allowed to ask the supplementary questions, move the resolutions on the budget, and so on. The ICA, Indian Council Act 1909, introduced a system of communal representation for Muslim, concept of separate electorate. Like the Muslim representative could only be voted by the Muslims. No Hindu will vote for the Muslim candidate, and the Muslim candidate even not could received a vote from Hindu. That means that was the separation of religion even in the voting process, marked by the separate electorate. The beginning of the non-official resolution in the council, granted for the first time, provided for the first time association of Indians with the executive councils of the Viceroy and governors. Satendra Prasad Sinha, also known as SP Sinha, became the first Indian to join the Viceroy's Executive Council. He was appointed as the law member to look after the lawmaking process. Then, the Government of India Act 1990. Features of this act. This act, also known as Montagu and Chelmsford reforms. Again, the Montagu was the Secretary of State. Chelmsford was the Viceroy of India. So they both formulated this act. So that's why it is known as Montagu and Chelmsford reforms. Also, the Government of India Act 1990. First, the demarcation of separate central and provincial subject. The central and provincial legislatures could make laws on their respective list of subject responsible government. Like today, if we talk about, in today we have union list that states the matters on which only the central government could make a law. State list having the matters on which the state government could make law. Remember, the central government could make law on the state list also under certain conditions, and then concurrent list. Concurrent list carries those topics on which both the central and the state government make law. But if there is any condition where the matter is same, for example, if we talk about education, the education is now a part of the concurrent list. If the state government makes a law over the education, and the central government also makes a law over the education, and the both law conflicting with each other, so always the central government law will prevail over the state law. Remember this. So this division of union or state list was first time introduced in the 1990. Office of the High Commissioner of India was created in London. Diarchy was applied on a state by state basis. It refers to the presence of two government in which one is responsible and the other is not. Transferred subject, governor with ministers responsible. Reserved subjects, governor with executive. It extended the communal representation or separate electorate, including the Sikh, Indian Christians, Anglo Indians, and Europeans. Like in 1909, the separate electorate was exclusively for the Muslims also. Now, the provision got extended to Sikh, Indian Christians, Anglo Indians, and Europeans. That simply represents the minorities in India of that time. Upper house and lower house divided. First time, bicameralism and direct elections in the country was introduced, but only at the central level. That means the state or provincial levels had nothing like this. It separated for the first time the provincial budgets from the central budget and authorized the provincial legislature to enact their budget. Like previously, the central government was responsible to make the central budget as well as the provincial budgets. Now, the provincial government were allowed to make their own budgets, and the central government was no longer required to interfere in their budgetary process. Provided for the establishment of a public service commission to appoint the person at, on the positions of civil services in India. Provided for the appointment of statutory commission to inquire into and report on its working after 10 years of its coming into force. Granted franchisee to a limited number of people on the basis of property, tax, or education to work or to vote. That means they had no provision of universal adult franchisee like we had in India today. But on the basis of property, tax, or education, the voting rights were granted to Indians on the certain basis. Then the Simon Commission or Simon Commission. The Simon Commission, commissioned by the British government in 1927, and the head of the commission was Chairman John Simon. He was tasked with reviewing the functioning of the Government of India Act 1919 and proposing the future measures. Comprising the 7 British members of the Parliament, including the chairman, the commission extended the timeline for provincial governance. Among its recommendations were the establishment of a federation encompassing the British India and the princely state, with the communal electorate persisting. Subsequently, the British government announced the organization of 3 round table conferences to assess and discuss the proposal that were put forth by the Simon Commission. This process culminated in the publication of white paper outlining the agreed upon constitutional reform. Like we could say, basically, the British government appointed the Simon Commission to review the Government of India Act 1990. But that commission did not comprise any Indian. So when the commission arrived in the country, that was opposed by the political leaders and even the local people of the country because that commission was required to look after the Indian conditions. But there was no Indian on board in the commission. And to discuss the report of the commission, the roundtable conferences were organized by the British government. And as we know, the first roundtable conference was boycotted by the Indian National Congress. Second was appointed, but the third again got boycotted. These initiatives collectively laid the groundwork for the subsequent Government of India Act and 1935. Now the Communal Award. The Communal Award was created by the British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald on 16th August 1932. That's why it is also known as MacDonald Award. Extended the separate electorates to depressed class like scheduled caste as well as the Muslims, Sikh, Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians and the Europeans. Now the Government of India Act 1935. Features of the Act. This Act intended to bring completely responsible government in India, abolish the diarchy in the provinces and introduce the provincial autonomy in its place. It started diarchy at the center. Provided for the establishment of All India Federation consisting of provinces and princely states as the unit. Note, princely state did not join and so federation did not come into existence. Bicameralism was introduced in 6 provinces and these provinces were Bengal, Bombay, Madras, Bihar, Assam and the United Province that is currently known as Uttar Pradesh. It divided the powers between the center and the units in terms of 3 lists: federal list, provincial list, and the concurrent list, like union list, state list, and concurrent list. Similar like this. Extended the separate electorates for deprived class, scheduled caste, women, labor, workers. Establishment of the Reserve Bank of India to control the currency and credit of the country was also associated with this act, as the RBI Act was passed in 1934 and the RBI was established on 1st April 1935 with the headquarters initially at Kolkata, later shifted to Bombay. And still the headquarters are at Bombay. Now, what were the features of this act? Established the Federal Court in 1937. Federal PSC plus provincial PSC on lines of UPSC plus SPSC, like Federal Public Service Commission and Provincial Service Commission. Like today, we have Union Public Service Commission to appoint the person at civil services on the level of central government. Then State Public Service Commission to appoint the person at civil services on the level of state. Similar thing was introduced there in the Government of India Act of 1935. Then Indian Independence Act of 1947. Features of the act. Ended the British rule in India and declared India as an independent and sovereign state that is applicable from August 15, 1947. And that's the time we celebrate our independence. Provided for the partition of India and creation of 2 new dominions like India and Pakistan. Proclaimed the lapse of British paramountcy over the Indian princely states and treaty relations with tribal areas that were applicable from August 15, 1947. That means the British had no deal with the Indian princely state and the tribal areas on or after 15th August 1947. Granted freedom to the Indian princely states that they were allowed to join the Dominion of India if they wanted to be, or Dominion of Pakistan. Or if they don't want to be part of India or Pakistan, so they could be remain independent. Abolished the office of Viceroy and provided for each dominion a Governor General who was to be appointed by the British King on the advice of the Dominion Cabinet. Empowered the constituent assemblies of the 2 dominions to frame and adopt any constitution for their respective nations and to repeal any act of the British Parliament, including the Independence Act itself. Governance of each dominion was to be conducted based on the provisions of the Government of India Act 1985. The British monarch could no longer ask for bills or veto them. However, this was reserved for the Governor General, who were be appointed by the British on the advice of Provinces Cabinet. Designated the Governor General of India and the Provincial Governor as constitutional or nominal heads of the state. They were made to act on the advice of the respective Council of Ministers in all matters. Interim Government 1946. Jawaharlal Nehru, portfolios head. He was the head of the portfolios of Vice President of the Commonwealth Relations, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, Broadcasting, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, Food and Agriculture, Dr. John Mathai, Industries and Supplies, Jagjeevan Ram, Labor, Sardar Baldev Singh, Defense, C.H. Bhava, Works, Mines and Power, Liaquat Ali Khan, Finance, Abdul Rahab Nishtar, Post and Air, then Asraf Ali, Railways and Transport, C. Rajagopalachari, Education and Arts, I.I. Chundrigar, Commerce, Ghaznafar Ali Khan, Health, Joginder Nath Mandal, Law. These members of the interim government were members of the Viceroy Executive Council. The Viceroy continued to be the head of the council. First Cabinet of Free India, 1947. Jawaharlal Nehru, Prime Minister, External Affairs and Commonwealth Relations and Scientific Research. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, Broadcasting States. Dr. Rajendra Prasad, Food and Agriculture. Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad, Education. Dr. John Mathai, Railways and Transport. R.K. Shangmungam Chetty, Finance. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, Law. Jagjeevan Ram, Labor. Sardar Baldev Singh, Defense. Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, Health. C.H. Bhava, Commerce. Rafi Ahmed Kidwai, Commonwealth. V.N. Gadgil, Works, Mines and Power. Dr. Shama Prasad Mukherjee, Industries and Supply. So with this, we have finished this part. Now it is requested to all of you kindly revise the facts and figures that all we have discussed in this lecture and keep yourself ready for the next lecture. With this note, let's end this lecture and thank you.